Welcome into the Odson Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Prehm, Eric Scopel on the show as always, and welcome to another edition. It's bye week. There is no game for the University of Oregon this weekend, which is ironically enough something we were a little bummed about at the start of the year, but I think it's kind of come at a time where the team could use a bye week opportunity to get more guys back from injury or make their debuts, and also some time to work out some kinks on both sides of the football. And today, we're going to discuss kind of our takeaways through three games on the offensive side of the football. There's plenty of good, there's plenty of bad. Eric, let's start with the obvious one of quarterback, the easiest one, the most popular one probably. Second, maybe most popular to the offensive line, but quarterback. It's a different dynamic this season. A different quarterback spins it different, but it's also much of the same that we have seen the last 2 years with Bo Nix, if not better.
Well, yeah, my biggest takeaway at quarterback is this Will Stein offense is just a high completion percentage operation. I won't say Dylan's been better than Bo because so far I don't know if they faced a defense that can really hold the water of some of the defenses we saw a year ago. But I did this for a story I wrote. Bo increased his completion percentage by 15.5 points from his time at Auburn at Oregon, from 59.4% at Auburn to 74.9% at Oregon. And so far, I know it's 3 games, Gabriel's over 20% above where he was at UCF and Oklahoma. It's 84%, which frankly, Matt, that feels kind of untenable, doesn't it? 80%? Yeah. Like, this is crazy. Do you remember when it was like if a guy was completing 62 to 64%, it was like, this guy's super accurate.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there was a time where 56% was you're not the best, but you're elite. And now if you're 56, you're bad.
You're benched probably. So that's been one of my biggest takeaways at quarterback, obviously, is Dylan is in position right now to break Bo's single season completion percentage record. And beyond that, I guess, because that's only a small part of it. And we know what part of that is that the offense is easy on quarterbacks to a certain degree in terms of just the depth of target, in terms of getting guys open. But Dylan has obviously done a great job of kind of running that offense. And then 2 other things I have written down here about Dylan in particular. He can throw the ball downfield, I think, better than people maybe gave him credit for early. Last couple of games, he's been really accurate there. Currently this season, 5 of 9 with 2 touchdowns on passes, 20 yards or more downfield. So I don't know if that part is as big of a concern as it felt like it might be coming out of the first game where everyone was like, what's going on? They can't hit these deep shots. I think we've seen that kind of develop. And then the other part was the running game. And I don't know how frequent they're going to go there, but we saw in Corvallis, this guy can be a dynamic runner with the ball. Obviously, that 54-yard touchdown, which was credit to the offensive line and the receivers blocked very, very well. But Dylan had the wheels to get down the sideline and run there. So 2 things that kind of in the first couple of weeks didn't feel like real weapons: the vertical pass game, the QB run game. I think we've kind of seen now, especially in Corvallis, that both of those things can be a big part of this offense.
The big thing for me through 3 games is Dylan's in the top 10, I believe, in yards passing per game. He's where is he? I just had it there. He's 11th. Sorry, he's just outside the top 10 at 304 yards per game. And I think my first kind of glance at that was, oh wow, he's probably going to be near the top, and then in terms of attempts, like, throwing for 300 yards on a consistent basis means you're probably throwing the ball a lot. And you look for him and cross the country, and it's like, oh, I got to scroll all the way down to 32nd. Like, he's that, and that kind of changed my perspective a little bit of the offense and the lack of explosive plays and the downfield passing attack. Like, you don't throw for 300 yards a game and you're outside the top 30 in pass attempts. He's still under 100. And you look at the guys that are, averaging 300 yards or more, and Dylan is one of 5 guys that has so far attempted less than 100 passing attempts. Some of that's aided by some huge explosion plays that we've seen the last couple of weeks. You know, Jaden Lamar's 63 or whatever it was. Evan Stewart had like a 60 something yarder. Trayshawn had a 50 yarder. But that speaks to this offense and the explosive ability it has at the quarterback position. I think also the week 3 performance it's eased a lot of the concerns. I will be more on board with it after we see probably 2 more games against UCLA and against Michigan State, because let's be real, like Oregon State isn't very good, and you don't want to just instantly say, oh, they're back, they're fine, everything's good, you know, they're gonna go and play Ohio State and they're gonna be fine. But you want to see the continuing happening of this. But Dylan Gabriel looks really good, and I don't think as week 1 there was a lot of concerns. I had them.
For sure.
Like, hey, like a lot of this could be on Dylan. I don't think it was. I think he was part of it. I don't think it was all of it. And I really think he's really good. Breaking news: Dylan Gabriel is really good.
I had 2 more thoughts on quarterback, and we can move on. The other one is the area I would get nervous with Dylan is when there isn't as clean of a pocket as we saw Saturday. I still think you go back to obviously the Idaho and Boise State games where Oregon gave up 7 combined sacks in those 2 games. Not that he played terrible in those games, but pretty clearly I think his best was on Saturday, where he had just complete command of the offense. And I think so much of that was clean pocket. I think he was really rushed, and truly forced to move around the pocket 2 or 3 times the entire game. So we'll see when they play some of these teams with a little bit more of a pass rush. Obviously, Ohio State comes to mind with the caliber of guys they have coming off the edge. How they pick that up, but there's reasons to be optimistic. And then the last thing I had was just that it does appear clear Dante Moore is the number 2, which we were kind of waiting, and kind of everybody felt that was the case, but it took us 3 weeks for them to get a second quarterback on the field, and it was Dante. And frankly, Matt, he had one really nice throw that was down the sideline. I know we were both kind of like, oh my gosh, that was so effortless, but a penalty kind of stopped that from being a long pass to Kyler Casper, but that was a really, really nice throw. Obviously, very limited sample size, but he is clearly the number 2.
There's a difference, too. I think it's one throw, but we've seen – you and I have been to practice. Jared would probably say the same thing. We've been to practice. We've seen these guys throw. I'm not saying Dante Moore is going to be or is better than Dylan Gabriel, but the ball comes off differently than it does with Dylan. And I just stress that, Oregon has a backup and probably an heir apparent in Dante Moore that when he steps onto the field next year, you just see it. When Herbert threw as a freshman, Bo Nix, when he kind of got settled in at Oregon and he started showing his gun, Marcus Mariota, there's just guys that throw and you're like, oh yeah, that's different than everybody else. And you get those vibes with Dante Moore. And that was showcased by the throw that Eric was talking about, the back shoulder fade that was perfect spot. And I think Jeff Schwartz put it on Twitter, that was different. It's got a rocket.
Yeah. That's all I had on quarterback. Did you have anything else?
Yeah. Let's go to running back. Your thoughts here of just kind of what's transpired at this position group.
This was surprising to me. Jordan James actually, through 3 games, is outproducing Bucky Irving's per play and per game averages. So that sort of indicates he's ready for this bell cow role. And we also have to acknowledge, again, smaller sample size. He's played 3 games. Bucky played 14. I made the point earlier. There's been pretty mediocre defensive talent on the field most of these games. Obviously, Oregon didn't blow anyone out of the water, or at least not until the Beaver game. But Bucky faced some tougher defenses, but that stat sort of stands out. And then I also point out, the fact that Jordan is averaging close to 100 yards per game, I think 6.4 yards per carry. He's found the end zone 3 times. And this offensive line has been really inconsistent. I think speaks to the caliber of player he is. Matt, how many times this season already, and again, it's only a couple of games, have we seen him just run into 2 or 3 guys at the line of scrimmage, somehow find a way to get out and make what could have been a negative play or a no gain into 6 or 8 yards? It feels like he does that an awful lot. So my biggest takeaway is we thought he would be ready, and he's proven through 3 weeks he's ready to be kind of that number 1.
I've been probably banging this drum the longest that he would be better than Bucky if given the opportunities and the carries since last season. But to a degree, Eric, like I didn't think he would kind of produce nothing or something out of nothing as much, like you referenced, as he's done so far this season. And that to me is a scary thing for opponents because it's like, hey, Oregon's offensive line hasn't been really consistent through 3 games. We'll say the third game they were.
Yeah.
And look at the damage he's done with inconsistent blocking. What happens when Oregon's offensive line clicks, which we're starting to think that they are getting there, and the lanes get wider, the holes get bigger, and they're longer, they're available longer, and the vision gets easier for him. He's not having to, make something out of nothing more as frequently. 94 yards a game on basically 15 carries is pretty damn impressive. I think for me, the surprise has a little bit been what's behind him. Noah Whittington, like I don't want to say he's looked bad, but he also kind of hasn't been special like he was pre-injury his first year and a half at Oregon. He did have a good game against Oregon State. He had that touchdown run where he cut it outside and showed his speed for his one score, but 27 carries, 118 yards, under 4.4 yards per game or yards per carry average. Only getting like 9 carries a game, and it feels like his usage is probably a little bit down than where it was prior. I don't know if that's because Jordan James is just so good. If Noah Whittington's kind of working his way back from his knee injury last season or what, but it's been a little interesting that he's been a little slower out of the gate. And then, to go down the line, like they're not using 3 running backs like they did pre-injury last season with Whittington, when it was Bucky, Noah, and then Jordan James would get a little bit of a spill, here and there every game. It's basically Jordan, and then Whittington gets a little bit that's left, and nobody else. Jaden Lamar's had 3 attempts for 9 yards. Jay Harris has had 3 attempts for 3 yards. And it's been very clear that when a third back has needed to enter the game, Jay Harris isn't even close. He's only gotten into 1 game. Lamar has played in all 3, but it's special teams and some very small numbers of offensive snaps. But there's a clear indicator. James is 1, Whittington's 2, Lamar is 3, Jay Harris is 4, but it's 2 guys and not 3, which is the big change from the last 2 seasons.
That's where I was going to go next. Is just that samples of. I asked him like, how many running backs do you want to incorporate? I think he said 3 or 4, and we thought 3 or 4 meant, hey, they're going to incorporate all the names Matt was just talking about, and that just hasn't been the case. Snap counts through 3 games. James 121, Noah Whittington 78, and then Jaden Lamar 14. And Jay Harris has really only played in mop-up duty, or not really. That's what has actually taken place. So when you look at the rotation, it's really been just 2 guys, and I think Noah's been interesting to watch because obviously you're hyper focused on a guy who's coming off an ACL injury just to see how he looks. I think he looks plenty explosive in the open field, like that kickoff return touchdown. You saw the Jets there. Like it looks like he's back. The 2 longer runs he had against the Beavers on Saturday, where he kind of got off tackle, one of which he bounced, one of which I think was designed to do that. You kind of saw the acceleration. You saw his ability to do some things. He has been nowhere near as good as Jordan at kind of like churning through initial contact at the line of scrimmage. And to your point on the yards per carry, that's where I think that's really been the difference between these 2 guys is like, it'd be interesting to look. I know PFF tracks, I just don't have it in front of me. Like yards after first contact, I would guess Jordan is way ahead of Noah because it feels like if Noah is, and I don't want it to sound like too much of a knock, but this is kind of what I've seen. Noah's contacted early, he's just going to go down. Yeah. Jordan at least is able to wriggle through there, maybe make 1 guy miss, maybe keep his legs driving and fall forward for a couple extra yards, or even kind of, as we saw in what I still think is a touchdown against Oregon State, push his way upfield for added yards. So, yeah, no, there's definitely a difference between those 2 guys. And I think the rotation, I'll be very curious to see if Jaden's, if he sees an uptick, because back-to-back weeks he's scored touchdowns, one of which was off of a
Whittington.
Yep. And it's kind of like maybe this is a guy who, with a heads-up play one week, with a long screen pass the next, maybe he gets more opportunity going forward against UCLA. But yeah, you're right, Matt. It's pretty clear. There's two guys that they feel really comfortable using right now, and it's Jordan and it's Noah.
And I want to touch, or just let's put a bookmark in Kenyon Sadiq, because he's played some running back for Oregon, or he's played H-back, fly sweep type stuff. But just save that note for when we get to tight ends, because I've got some thoughts there. Because he's carried the ball more than we probably have expected him to this season so far. At receiver, I think this is just kind of like maybe the idea that Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson are going to lead the team in receiving yards, and they're going to have 1,000 yards each. Like maybe that idea isn't, and they're going to basically replicate what Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson did last season. Maybe that idea isn't going to happen, because I think this group, it's clear. 3 receivers have kind of emerged. We haven't seen Gary Bryant Jr. yet, and he hasn't played all season, dealing with some kind of injury. We'll see what happens there. But there's no Jurion Dickey. We saw a little bit of Kyler Casper and a little bit of Justice Lowe against Oregon State. But I think Casper was the first guy to get into the game when there was an injury to Trayshawn Holden, and I think week 1 mid-game. I don't have their snap counts in front of me, but it's clear like Tez, Trayshawn, and Evan are playing a ton. They're playing a bunch of Terrence Ferguson. They're playing a bunch of Kenyon Sadiq. They're playing a bunch of Patrick Herbert at tight end. And then everybody else that's kind of fallen down the list here a little bit. But at receiver, I honestly think it's a 3-headed monster. One game it could be Tez that leads the team in receiving. The next game it could be Trayshawn. And then the following week it could be Evan. And the targets, I'm assuming, are probably going to be a little skewed a little bit more towards Ted's, but it's probably not going to be a huge separation like it was last season with Troy and Tez to the next 3 and 4 guy. I wouldn't surprise me if these numbers are pretty close to each other, and it's just going to be a who's hot this week type of mentality.
Yeah, I wrote it feels like an equal opportunity pass offense, because you're right. Like Trayshawn, Evan, and Tez, like you go through the 3 games, like Tez has a lot of receptions, not a lot of yards, but gets 2 touchdowns in the opener, doesn't do much in the second game, and then has the big game in Corvallis. Evan kind of doesn't do anything in the first or third game, or very little, but in the middle game against Boise State has a couple of long catches, has a 100-yard game. And Trayshawn kind of been maybe the most consistent, but somebody who has, I think you see the upside from a big play perspective, but, maybe hasn't been incorporated quite the same as the other guys, but has been at least the most consistent in terms of like he hasn't had the dip game where he gets, what was it? Tez's case, -1 yards on 3 catches or something.
Yeah,
like that was weird. But those do feel like the guys they're going to rely on, and it's interesting because the talk in the offseason was, maybe we'll get to like 5 or 6 guys are being utilized here. Well, they've played these 3 guys 86% of the snaps according to PFF's snap count data. That is not what we've seen at all in terms of 5 or 6 guys. And Casper has played a decent amount. I think he's played over 50 snaps in 3 games. So if you do the math there, I think it's like about 17 per game. Justice Lowe's played about 10 per game. So those guys are being utilized in some capacity, but definitely not anywhere near as much as the other 3. And I think it'll be interesting to see if over the course of the season, what they do with those 2 guys, like do Kyler or Justice ever see an uptick? And then Gary Bryant's like the big question mark for me. I don't know what's going on there in terms of this is questionable both weeks. He dressed for both the home games. And then as far as I could tell, at least I never saw him in uniform in Corvallis. So we'll see. Dan said they're going to continue to assess it, and when he's ready, he'll be available to help them. But I'm not sure if that, I would have thought after the bye week was what they were targeting. I don't know if that's what we're going to get. And if that's the case, to the conversation we've already had, it really feels like it's a Trayshawn, Evan, Tez operation there with the other two kind of getting involved a little bit. Jurion is kind of the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
What do we make of this, Matt? Like, it just seems like this year was the year after basically a medical redshirt year a year ago where he really wasn't full strength until it sounds like the end. There was a lot of talk like this was going to be the year we saw him. 0 snaps so far through 3 games. Clearly at best number 6 on the receiver depth chart and probably 7 if Gary's healthy. It just feels like this isn't something that's happening this year, does it?
Yeah, I think this is the classic case that when you are an elite team like Oregon has been, just simply showing up and relying on athleticism and whatnot to find you on to get yourself on the field isn't always going to work. And that's not fair to Jurion. He was hurt last year and had to put his body in shape, but he's behind, and it's very clear. And Oregon's position group is loaded. They would not have gone after Evan Stewart last season if they felt like Jurion Dickey was 100% going to be what Evan Stewart's producing. Like, and that's not to say that they recruited over Jurion Dickey, but they felt like they needed more depth, more talent at that group to raise the bar and raise the standard, and that's what they did. And for Dickey, it's it's looking like there's going to be an opportunity where he's just not going to play this season. And it's unfortunate because I know there was a lot of excitement where he's a 5-star player. He's one of the best players that's signed on paper from a recruiting perspective, but it just hasn't clicked yet. Now, the catch becomes like, does he have? And it appears to me, like talking to him, I would think you would probably agree here. Like, he's got a pretty level head, and he seems to be pretty understanding. And like, does that hold true after a second straight year of seeing limited snaps? Does he hit that gear and find his way onto the football field? But right now, honestly, like, I'm not taking Tez off. I'm not taking Trayshawn off. I'm not taking Evan Stewart off a ton. And when Gary Bryant returns, if he does at some point, like, his production and his value exceeds what we've seen from Jurion Dickey or haven't seen from Jurion Dickey. So it's kind of realistically looking like, hey, if the path for Dickey and the same thing for Casper and for Lowe was if Oregon was going to actually expand their receiving room and play more than 4 guys. If they were, that creates the opportunity for playing time. But so far they haven't. And I think the question is, and as Dan put it, like, that's for us to know. You don't need to know that information, which is weird. Maybe like they're not actually going to do that. Like, maybe they're just going to stick with 4 guys. And if they are, there's no path for Dickey unless he significantly gets better. And that's the case for Lowe. That's the case for Casper. That's the case for McClellan, for Pelham, for Grisham. And I think what's hard and what's strange to adjust right now is Oregon used to be a program where you signed a 5-star kid and that guy had a path to playing time right away. It maybe wasn't going to be a starter role. It was going to be very similar to what Casper's doing right now. But you find it's just automatic because the program hasn't recruited the talent, hasn't recruited the athleticism, in quantity that makes it hard for a 5-star to show up. And Oregon is now at that point, at least at the receiver position, where even if you're a 5-star, it's like, dude, you may have to wait a little bit because the talent is here. And the question just becomes, is that going to be okay for Dickey?
Yeah. And we should note, like, this program does not play favorites with recruit rankings.
No.
Like Elijah Rushing, 5-star recruit, hasn't played yet in 3 games. Aiden Breland just got his first snaps last weekend. That was a kid who was at one point a 5-star. I think ended up being like a really high 4-star. He played like 10 snaps at the very end of the game in Corvallis. So, you've got to earn it here. And I think it's really notable just looking at we talked about this coming out of the first couple of games. Like, Oregon's barely playing any of these true freshmen. It was the highest rated recruiting class in school history. These guys aren't getting on the field. Like, if you're good enough, you're old enough part, it feels like right now a lot of these younger guys haven't proven they're good enough yet.
Yeah.
And Jurian definitely fits in that. And so I hope this doesn't sound like it's just like they're, there's a reason that they're not playing. I think the reason's pretty clear. He's just not good enough. And there's a lot of young guys who have great recruiting rankings who just haven't been good enough right now. And that could change. And maybe Jurian by the end of the year carves out a role, but I'm not betting on it based upon what we've seen through a couple of weeks, because the guys who are playing are producing really, really well. And he's clearly still behind a couple of guys right now.
All right, tight end position group. It's a interesting one. Terrence Ferguson continues to look good. 13 catches, 159 yards. No touchdowns yet for Ferg. Kenyon Sadiq is second on the team in tight ends for receptions with 7 for 75. And then Patrick Herbert has 4 catches for 26 yards. He does have that costly fumble, but all 3 guys playing a lot of football. All 3 guys kind of playing different types of roles. Ferguson is second on the team in total receptions at 13. I think it's very clear like he's become kind of a safety net for Dylan Gabriel, just as he was for Bo Nix the previous season. I think this group is talented. That I think, to Jared's point, if he was on here, he'd say he'd still like to see one more guy be available. I think we've seen Roger Sagapala play a couple snaps.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's
not
a ton, but you really can't count on it. It's a group I think is pretty darn good with its 3-headed monster attack. My point I was getting to earlier about Kenyon Sadiq, though, I don't think Oregon knows how to use him. It's weird. He gets put into weird spots, end arounds, the 4th down carry. He's been in the backfield a little bit. It's a weird dynamic where it feels like they're forcing things a little bit with him on the field. And it's still trying to figure out, okay, where is he best suited? Where can he help us the most? I think they're struggling to keep him involved and find ways to like, hey, we're going to go with Ferguson and Sadiq together, or Pat and Sadiq together. But where does he fit? How does he help, be unique? I don't know. There's just been some weird plays out there with him that just feel forced.
That's interesting, and I think you might be right. I mean, I'm now thinking through his role, like and to start, like Herbert still plays a lot more than Sadiq, and one stat I wrote in the story here was that Sadiq's played 44 of his 69 snaps basically at receiver, whether that be in the slot or split out wide. He's basically playing more running back / slot / outside receiver than tight end. And the thing that is kind of interesting with a dynamic athlete like this is I understand the instincts to get the ball to them in space and let them go, because that's kind of what, to your point, it's been what they've done. It's either handoffs or short passes. I think he's had 1 catch kind of downfield so far. I wonder if we'll see that part change a little bit, because with his athleticism and speed, like, sure, he's going to be dynamic with the ball. And I'd love to see him touch the football as much as possible. And if those are, higher likelihood of being successful, the closer he is to the line of scrimmage, then so be it. But I also think with a player with his sort of athleticism, why not see if he can beat a linebacker down the seam for like a 30-yard play? You know what I mean? Like, it feels like those things we're not seeing even enough much opportunity with that from what we've seen. So I think that's an interesting part. He, again, is basically 25 of his 65 snaps have basically been at tight end. Like, he's not really playing, like the majority of his snaps aren't there. So he's an interesting player. And we kind of knew this going into the season. He was going to be used a lot of different ways. And we'll kind of see if that gets streamlined or if he just continues to be kind of a gadget guy. But yeah, right now he's not really, I'll put it this way. When he's on the field, it's like you assume something is going for him. Like, he's going to be involved. And a lot of times those plays have been a little disappointing based upon the kind of athlete he is. And again, unfortunately, on Saturday, he had a really nice play and was brought back because of a Terrence Ferguson holding penalty or block in the back. But I think everybody'd like to see a little bit more out of Kenyon to this point. One other thing,
maybe that's the 4th receiver that's played in terms of Gary not being available. But maybe it's Kenyon Sadiq has just elevated himself, where it's like, hey, we feel like Sadiq's a better player, even at receiver, even though he's a tight end, than playing a Casper or a Lowe or a Dickey.
I mean, that's actually a fair point. Like Sadiq, if you just base it on where they're actually playing, Sadiq and Casper have played basically the same number of snaps at receiver. So if you want to talk about expanding the receiving depth, maybe we can say, hey, they actually are. It's just a guy who is listed as a tight end is one who's playing there. And then I did have one thing on Ferguson before we can move on to offensive line, which is I think it was funny after the first couple of games, people were like, oh, they're not utilizing him as much. And the reality is they're actually utilizing him a lot more than they were before. I think people maybe misremember his kind of role in the past, but through 3 games, he's on pace for 61 catches and 742 yards. That would be over a 14-game season, which is, I think,
pretty impressive.
The minimum. That would be like Oregon record-setting
yes
stats for tight ends. And last year he was at like 40 catches for 400 yards. So it might not feel like it, but I still think he's actually been incorporated quite a bit more than he was in past seasons. And there's a chance this is a really special tight end season from him. Again, really, really early. Still hasn't found the end zone. We know that part will come because he's a great red zone option. But I think they've done a good job of utilizing him earlier on in games. Like last week against Corvallis, I think it was the second or third drive. It was like back-to-back passes right to him to start the drive. Both of them went for first downs, kind of got some momentum going. I think this is a player who's clearly a favorite of Dylan's, and they're utilizing him a lot. So, yeah, that's basically all I had other than to say, like, Sali Apaga's played 6 snaps from scrimmage, and those all came against Oregon State. And then Zach Grace is the team's fullback when they go into those heavy position or those heavy packages. We saw him, I think, lead block for a touchdown in the opener. But these guys are playing very, very, very slim number of snaps, and it really is kind of a 3-headed group right now.
All right, let's move to the hot topic, the offensive line, the one probably the most discussed in a long time, in a negative manner at least, for Oregon football. And that's a group that's been surprisingly inconsistent considering the last couple of seasons with multiple different lineup changes because of graduation or guys going pro. They just hit the ground running. And for the third year and the landing era, it's been a grind. They've literally had to grind through some struggles to find their way. They looked really poor the first 2 weeks of the season. They looked really, really good against Oregon State. 2 kind of okay-ish bad performances, 1 good performance against probably a team, let's be real, Idaho would give Oregon State a really good run, I feel like. So you don't want to overreact, but at the same time, you kind of have to take into account maybe they did take a step in the right direction. We've seen 2 different guys take snaps at center. Charlie Pickard started the first 2 games, and then Poncho got the third. In the second game, they shared the job. We saw Nishad Strother make his start against Oregon State, came off the bench against Boise State. I don't think really played against Idaho. Maybe it was special teams. And we've seen Marcus Harper go from left guard to right guard, back to left guard, to back and forth. And then after that, no one really plays along the offensive line, which is par for the course. Like 6 guys is about normal. But it's been inconsistent. And I think Johnny Cornelius is kind of found, he's leveled out. He was really up and down. Now against Oregon State, he was solid. I think Josh Connolly's gotten a little bit better as the year has gone on. But it's Marcus Harper, it's Poncho, and it was Pickard to start that really struggled. And against Oregon State, they pulled Pickard. They did not play him until the end. They started Poncho at the position that he had been training all season for. And it kind of goes to our point of, like, we talked about after the Oregon State game of just like, I wish we could get True Serum to figure out what happened in the month of August, where they prepared all offseason for Poncho to be the center, and then they went away from it. And a new plan was created at the last minute. And now they've kind of gone back to their original plan of Poncho at center. And Dan today said that he needs to still get better at some things, and some snaps need to get cleaned up. But it was a weird dynamic there. That maybe they've kind of settled things in. The Bedford injury needs to be mentioned, and maybe that threw a wrench in the operation. But it's a perplexed move that I don't think we'll ever get the answer to.
Well, I think my assessment of what happened would be Bedford got hurt and they misevaluated. And I don't want to make this sound like I know better than the coaches necessarily, but they probably put too much faith in Charlie being able to play center and not enough faith in Nishad Strother being able to play guard at a high level. Because as we talked about, that felt like, didn't that kind of feel like what this was about a little bit? Was like,
Yes.
Who's actually your fifth best guy? Because Poncho's never been, or Harper have never really been candidates to be taken out. It's always been, okay, but who's the other guy? Who's, if you've got your four, who's the fifth? And it felt like they thought, well, Pickard can handle center better than Strother can handle being the second guard. And I think it was pretty clear in the games that we've seen so far that Strother's a much better player than Pickard. Like, I thought Strother was really strong in the Oregon State game. I thought he had some great run blocks. I thought he held up. Obviously, everybody held up pretty well in pass protection. So, like, that's a guy who, to me, seems clearly ahead of where Charlie was, where Charlie could seemingly get the ball to the quarterback, but didn't do a whole lot after the snap. Yeah. And there were, of course, the issues in the Boise State game, one of which cost them late for what could have been a game-deciding mistake where Dylan puts up the stop sign and Charlie snaps it anyway. And now we've got Dylan trying to do some stuff and he ends up fumbling the ball, and you know what happens next. So I think pretty clearly they know Poncho's their guy. And Dan said he did some really good things on Saturday. We spoke with Dan maybe an hour and a half ago on Wednesday here, bi-week, the first and only bi-week media availability. And yeah, he had some nice things to say about Poncho. He did point out he had some inconsistencies with the snaps, or there's some snap things that need to be worked on. But overall, I think he's clearly your guy there. And now it becomes, and this is the big question for me, is what do you do at guard? Does Bedford just step in immediately? Dan was pretty kind of up in the air with that. Didn't really want to be decisive one way or definitive one way or the other. Not that I would expect him to be, just knowing how he operates. But, it feels like it's between Bedford, Strother, and Harper, and they've got two spots, and one of those guys is going to be left out. And I don't know which way I'd lean right now, but I do know that the group we saw in Corvallis looked pretty good. And if you can bottle that and continue to play at that level, you've got a chance going forward. So we'll see. I think that's, to me, still the biggest question mark on the entire offense is what are you doing with that one guard spot? Is there a world where Harper gets left out? It feels unlikely. He's a 3-year starter. But Strother's playing
He's
at a high.
He's playing the worst, though, of all the offensive linemen. And if you look at the PFF grades, he's the only one that's in the 50s for offensive grade, run block grade, and pass block grade. Everybody else along the offensive line has at least one area where they can say, like, we're doing above average performance here. Mm-hmm. Charlie Pickard, for example, like, he's worse in run blocking than Marcus Harper, and he's worse in his overall offensive grade than Marcus Harper, but he is significantly higher. He's 13 points higher in PFF's grading system than Marcus Harper in pass blocking. That's astonishing. From where Marcus was the first 2 seasons of his starting career at Oregon to where he's been playing at this season. And your Strother point, like, it's kind of like when I went back to the overall arching theme of the offense. Like, let's see it happen a couple more times before we truly say, like, hey, things are figured out, just because of the quality of opponent they played against Oregon State. But this applies with Strother. He is the second highest graded offensive lineman that's in that 6-man rotation from a pass blocking perspective. And he's the number 1 offensive lineman from a run blocking perspective. And it almost, to me, turns into, when Bedford gets fully back, now you're working Bedford versus Harper. And if Strother continues to play in the way that he's played against Oregon State, in 2 weeks at UCLA and the following week against Michigan State at home. But that's, to me, like, if you're long-term projecting out where this battle is going to go once Bedford gets back, because he's been good and he's done his job. I think Cornelius has kind of solidified himself a little bit. Connerly hasn't played to his standard consistently, but it's rounding into form, and it's clear Harper has not played good. Poncho is best at center, and you're not going to take him off the field.
Yeah, I agree.
And it turns into one spot.
And the thing that is optimal right now is you're in bye week, and this is what bye weeks are made for. Yep. Dan had a couple good answers on sort of bye week topics. You asked a question about getting players developed that haven't been playing. That's another thing you see here. But when you have, as we've kind of alluded to for the last couple of minutes here, a big question mark at who's starting at one of these spots, what a perfect time to get some of those answers. And the other thing is, again, this is going to sound very dismissive of UCLA, but based upon what they put on the field, I feel comfortable being dismissive of UCLA. That's going to be a glorified scrimmage. That team might be worse than Oregon State. That's a really bad Big Ten team. They just got absolutely housed at home by Indiana, who might be pretty good this year, but UCLA's clearly not been good.
Still Indiana. They've equaled their win total in 3 weeks than they did last season.
Exactly. So you lost to you got boat raced by 4 scores at home to a team that won 3 games last year, I think. So, you look at UCLA and you go, that might not be a game where you learn a lot, but that might be a perfect game to experiment a little bit and kind of mess around with stuff and just see what sticks and what works. So, and then Michigan State is going to be tougher than UCLA, but that's a home game and a game where I think you might also be able to have a little bit more, opportunity to be creative, because let's be real. The season comes down to October 12th, and you've got to figure out your best 5 there. And I think this schedule actually sets up pretty well, where you've got this bye week and you've got a couple of games there where you can kind of mix and match. And maybe you want to be 100% confident by the end of the Michigan State game with what you've got and finish the game with that group. But from that perspective of figuring it out, Matt, because I think everybody listening and all of us that will talk about this over the next couple of weeks agree, there's still decisions to be made there.
Yep.
And I think it's really beneficial to a certain degree how the schedule plays out for them.
And it kind of goes into just the overarching closing thoughts here on the offensive side is they've got about 2.5 weeks left where the season doesn't boil down to winning or losing against Ohio State. But the idea that you can put yourself into a position where you get a first round bye or you're automatically in the college football playoff, should you go 12-1 or 11-2, that hinges on what happens against Ohio State on October 12th. If Oregon goes out and beats Ohio State at home and then loses to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game and they finish the year 11-1, or maybe they finish the year not 11-1, they finish the year 12-1, or maybe it's 11-2, and you have 2 losses, but you can go out and you can say, hey, we beat the Big Ten champion. And let's just say Ohio State's they're 12-1 going into the college football playoff. They get one of the top 4 byes. You have that claim of we should be the highest rated team that's not a conference champion because we have a victory over one of those top 4, which realistically will probably be a top 2 or 3 team in college football. That's why this game is so important. And that's why this team has 2 games left and a half of a week of a bye to kind of round themselves into form, figure things out a little bit, because there will be a game where maybe it's at Purdue on a Friday night in middle of October, or maybe it's a end of season November game at Wisconsin against a team that lost their starting quarterback for the season, but you don't play good. And we've seen it in the Pac-12, a Stanford game. One of those opportunities is going to present itself where it's going to be a grind, even though it never should have been. And you can't afford to slip up and lose a really bad game and have lost previously to Ohio State.
Good points. And just not to extend this too much, that the schedule post Ohio State, the caliber of opponent there is even less scary than it was to start the season. You go through, I think Illinois might be the best team Oregon plays. I mean, I don't want to totally discount Michigan because they're still going to get it figured out, but Michigan has not looked very good. Illinois at least has a win over, I think it was a ranked Kansas State team a couple weeks ago. Wisconsin's lost its quarterback for the season. Washington just lost its Apple Cup game, and I think it's looked pretty iffy through a couple of weeks. And there's going to be distractions about Jed Fish and that Florida job, it sounds like, all the way through the rest of the season. Maryland hasn't looked incredible. I think they lost to Michigan State. Purdue just lost 66-7 at home to Notre Dame. So you run through the rest of the schedule, and after we talked about UCLA, there's just a lot of these teams haven't looked great. And I do think, again, it doesn't all boil down to Ohio State, but, it feels crazy to still suggest, considering that this Oregon team's played one good game all season, that they could go 12-0. But the schedule isn't super scary to me after Ohio State. And if you can get yourself to elevate for that one Saturday, and maybe you play a full season here, a regular season, and you only have one A-plus game, but if that A-plus game goes against Ohio State, you might still be able to be a 1 or a 0 loss team going into Big Ten championship game. Again, that feels probably a little too forward thinking. Oregon needs to prove it these next couple of weeks. Shoot, they better come out and just absolutely clobber UCLA and beat Michigan State decisively before they get to Ohio State. But you get my point. Like, if you run through that schedule, it's not heavy hitters the way you thought maybe it would be going into the year. And there's been some developments that haven't been real positive for a lot of the teams, kind of especially in that November run.
It's going to be an interesting final 2 weeks before that Ohio State game, and then what comes in that game, and then after. We'll have full coverage of this Oregon football team and its run to the Big Ten, and hopefully the Big Ten championship for our sake at duckterritory.com. And until the next one, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.